Hey guys, just a quick thank you to all of you amazing legends that are subscribed. I could not have done it without you. But most of you listening aren't subscribed, so please do us a favor and hit the subscribe button and like this video. It's free and it really helps our small team out. I should have known better, but when I met Judah on Bumble, everything seemed perfect. His profile was polished with pictures of him in sharp suits, driving expensive cars, and traveling to places that looked straight out of a magazine. He had this whole successful businessman vibe, and honestly, I got sucked into it. It didn't hurt that his messages were always charming and well thought out. He had that way of making you feel special, like you were the only one he was talking to. One day, out of nowhere, he messaged me saying that he had just closed a big deal and wanted to celebrate. He invited me to a fancy seafood restaurant he claimed was one of his favorites. I had no idea what to expect, but I figured why not? I like the idea of a nice dinner, especially with someone who seems like they had their life together. Maybe this could be the start of something great. So I threw on my best dress, did my hair, and tried to ignore the butterflies in my stomach. I didn't expect a huge deal out of the night, just dinner and maybe some nice conversation. When I arrived at the restaurant, I was immediately impressed. It was one of those places where the waiters wore tuxedos and the lighting was dim enough to make everything feel extra fancy. The kind of place you see in the movies, but don't think you'll ever step foot in. Judah greeted me with a smile that could melt anyone's heart. He was dressed impeccably, as always. He led me to our table, which was right by a window with a perfect view of the city skyline. The ambience was top-notch, and I couldn't help but think that I might have found someone truly special. He quickly got down to business, telling me how proud he was of the new deal he had just signed. According to him, he was on the verge of becoming a huge player in some industry I didn't really understand. But it didn't matter, he was rich, successful, and more than willing to spend a lavish amount of money on our dinner. Order whatever you want, he said, practically pushing the menu toward me. I was a little taken aback by how casual he was about it, but I figured, hey, why not? I ordered a few things that caught my eye, some fancy seafood dishes and even a caviar appetizer because why not go all out? We were having a good time at first. The food was incredible, the atmosphere was great, and Judah was even fun to talk to. But then things took a weird turn. He suddenly said he needed to take an important phone call. No big deal, I thought. It seemed like a business thing, probably something important given all the talk about his new deal. So he left the table and went outside. I sat there, sipping my drink and scrolling through my phone, not really thinking much of it. But after 15 minutes, I started to wonder what was going on. Maybe the call was taking longer than expected. No big deal. Another 15 minutes passed. I started to feel a little uncomfortable, but I shrugged it off. It wasn't uncommon for people to get caught up in work, right? By the time 30 minutes had passed, I was starting to get annoyed. My food was long finished, and I felt like I was sitting alone in this fancy restaurant with a mountain of food in front of me that I couldn't really finish. It didn't help that people were glancing at me, probably wondering why I was sitting alone at such a nice table. I decided to text Judah just to check in. I got a reply almost immediately saying that he'd be another 10 minutes. I could deal with that, I thought. But then another 30 minutes passed, and I still didn't hear from him. At this point, I was kind of over it. I just wanted to get out of there and go home. I called him, but the call went straight to voicemail. That's when the sinking feeling in my stomach hit me. I sent him a few more texts, but nothing. Just complete silence. I sat there staring at my phone, trying to wrap my head around what was happening. Was he ghosting me? Why would he just disappear in the middle of everything? It didn't make sense, especially after all the money he was acting like he was willing to spend. I was starting to feel like I had been played, but I still couldn't understand why he would go through all this trouble just to bail. Eventually, the waiter came over with a check. I glanced down at the total and my heart dropped. It was over $3,000. I couldn't believe it. That was literally 3 times what I had in my savings. How could this even be happening? What kind of restaurant was this? I was in shock. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how I was going to pay for this meal when the person who invited me wasn't even here. I tried calling Judah one more time. Straight to voicemail. I checked my messages, and that's when I saw it. I was blocked. He had blocked me. I sat there, frozen, staring at my phone, unable to process what had just happened. The waiter stood there awkwardly, waiting for me to figure out what I was going to do. I didn't even know what to say. I was too embarrassed. I was in a situation that felt completely out of my control, and I had no idea how I was going to get out of it. Eventually, I had to ask the waiter if they could help me somehow, but even they didn't know what to do. I called a friend who ended up covering part of the bill, but it still wasn't enough. I had to borrow from multiple people just to scrape together enough money to cover the meal. It was humiliating. That night was a blur. I was left with nothing but the crushing reality that I had been completely used. Judah wasn't the businessman he claimed to be. He wasn't even a decent human being. He just wanted to make me feel small, make me feel like nothing more than a tool to get whatever he wanted. And I let it happen. I don't know what the point of the whole night was. Maybe it was to make me feel like I wasn't good enough, or maybe he just wanted to see how far he could push me. All I know is that I'll never forget the feeling of sitting alone at that table, staring at an outrageous bill, wondering how I ended up in such a messed up situation. I've heard of some sketchy Tinder dates, but the one I went on, it takes the cake. Let me tell you, I learned my lesson that night. And before you say anything, yes, I know how dumb it sounds. Anyway, here's what happened. So, I matched with this guy named Ryan. He seemed pretty normal at first, just a regular guy with a decent profile and a few casual conversations. We talked about hobbies, movies, and whatever. Honestly, it was a pretty chill vibe. After a couple of days of chatting, Ryan mentioned that he had this awesome man cave in his basement that he'd spent months working on. He said it was full of cool stuff: posters, arcade games, some vintage stuff. The usual. I wasn't really looking for anything serious. I had just broken up with someone, and I figured a casual meetup wouldn't hurt. Plus, I'd never seen a man cave, and it sounded like an interesting place to hang out for an hour or so. He promised it would be a relaxed vibe, so I agreed to meet at his place. When I pulled up to his house, it looked totally normal. Two-story, decent neighborhood, nothing too fancy, nothing sketchy. I texted him when I was parked, and he came out to greet you right away. I wasn't nervous at first. He was friendly, maybe a little quieter than I expected, but still cool. He let me inside, and we went straight to the basement. Now, this is where things started to feel a little off. The basement had that old house smell, musty, kind of damp. The lights were dim, and the place had a weird, almost unfinished vibe. There were posters on the walls, sure, and some old movie memorabilia. But there was something about the whole atmosphere that felt forced, like he was trying too hard to make it look cool instead of just letting it be. As he was showing me around, we chatted a little. Ryan was talking about how he loved working with his hands, fixing up things, and how he didn't mind being alone a lot. I was just nodding along, trying to keep things casual. Honestly, I wasn't paying much attention to the room itself. I was more focused on getting through the date. But then things took a turn. He casually suggested that we go out to his car to grab something. I don't remember what exactly, but it didn't feel like anything out of the ordinary. He wasn't acting weird or anything, so I figured why not. I followed him out the door and we made our way to his driveway. That's when I saw it. I didn't even realize it at first, but when we got close to his car, I noticed the back seat. There were ropes in the back, tied in some weird knots. My brain couldn't even process it for a second. And then I saw hunting knives. A couple of them were stacked on the floor, one on top of the other. I tried to brush it off at first. Maybe he was into outdoorsy stuff. But then I saw the blood on the handle of one of the knives. I froze. I'm not proud of how I reacted, but I couldn't help myself. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat break out all over. I didn't even know what to think. I was suddenly hyper-aware of everything around me. The crunch of the gravel under my shoes, the way the streetlights cast these weird shadows on his driveway, the fact that I didn't even know this guy that well, and here I was in his yard with weapons in his car. I could feel my stomach drop. Something about the whole situation felt completely wrong. It was like my gut was screaming at me to leave, but I was frozen. I didn't know how to react. I tried to calm myself down, but the blood on the knife didn't lie. It wasn't something I could just brush off as a coincidence. And then, I don't know what got into me, but I snapped out of it. I looked at Ryan, who was standing a little too close, waiting for me to do something. It hit me like a ton of bricks. I needed to get out. I couldn't look at him anymore, not without seeing the knives, the ropes. I could barely breathe. I didn't even think. I just turned on my heels and bolted. I ran as fast as I could back to my car, practically throwing open the door and jumping inside. I'm pretty sure I was shaking as I started the engine. I looked in my rearview mirror to make sure Ryan wasn't following me, and thankfully I didn't see him. But the entire drive home, I couldn't shake the image of the blood-stained knife in his car. My mind kept running over the situation, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I got home, locked all the doors, and sat there for a while, just trying to calm down. I didn't even tell my friends about it right away. I was too freaked out to talk about it. I couldn't believe that something that seemed so normal at first could turn so twisted in a matter of seconds. Looking back, I'm honestly just glad I trusted my instincts and got out of there when I did. I haven't heard from Ryan since that night, and I really hope I never will. I'm still not sure what his deal was or if he was just some weird dude into creepy stuff, but I know for sure I don't want to find out. Now, I always trust my gut. If something feels off, I don't hesitate anymore. Because after that date, I realized that there are people out there who look totally normal, who seem completely fine at first, and then you see something that makes you realize you've been in danger the whole time. So if anyone out there reading this, if something doesn't feel right, run. Just run. Don't wait for it to get worse. It started out like any other Tinder match. I wasn't expecting much, just a bit of casual conversation. Maybe meet out for coffee or something. His name was Andy. His profile was decent. He had that mix of selfies and outdoor photos that looked like he had an interesting life. Not too much, but enough to catch my eye. He seemed sweet in his messages, a little flirty but not over the top. Everything felt pretty normal. But then one night, he dropped the bomb that changed everything. Andy told me about his dog, Max. He said Max was this golden retriever who had been with him for years, and that recently Max had been really sick. He said he took Max to the vet and found out that the poor dog needed a pretty expensive surgery, $3,000 to be exact. I could hear the pain in his messages. He said he was struggling financially, that he didn't have the money, and that he might lose Max if he couldn't get the surgery soon. He told me how heartbroken he was, how much he loved Max, and how he couldn't imagine his life without him. Honestly, it made me feel terrible. I love animals, and the idea of a dog in pain was enough to pull at my heartstrings. After a few back and forth messages, Andy asked me if I could help. He wasn't asking for much, he said, just $2,000. He promised to pay me back as soon as his next paycheck came in. His words were so convincing. I could feel the desperation in his text, the way he really needed someone to help him. And honestly, I wanted to help. I didn't have $2,000 lying around, but I figured I could give him $1,000. It seemed like a good way to help out, and I liked Andy. I thought he was genuine. I sent him the money, and after a while, I got a message from him saying, "Thank you so much. I can't believe you did this for me. Max will get the surgery, and I'll never forget this." He even sent me a picture of Max to show me how much it meant. I looked at the picture of this dog, and it looked like a really cute golden retriever. But then something made me stop. I noticed something weird. There was a watermark on the bottom right corner of the photo. It was faint, but it was definitely there. It looked like a stock photo website watermark. At first, I thought I might be imagining things, but when I zoomed in, it was crystal clear. I had a sinking feeling in my stomach. The photo wasn't his dog. It wasn't a personal photo. It was stock photography. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling. I started scrolling through my messages with Andy again, trying to see if I had missed something. The whole thing felt off now. Why would he send a stock photo? I thought back to the sob story about Max and how emotional he sounded. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how stupid I had been. I'd been duped. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I tried to message him, asking if that was really Max, but he didn't respond. I waited a few hours, thinking maybe he was just busy, but nothing. I messaged him again the next day. Still no reply. I figured maybe he was just caught up in whatever he had going on. But the more time passed, the more I started to get worried. I tried calling him, but it went straight to voicemail. Now I was really starting to panic. I felt like I'd been played. I opened up the bank app on my phone to check the transaction. It was confirmed. $1,000 sent and no way to get it back. My heart was pounding in my chest. I kept thinking, what if this guy was never real? What if I'd just been talking to some scammer this whole time? I decided to take one last step and look up Andy's profile again on Tinder. To my shock, it was gone. Just gone. He had completely disappeared. It was like he had never existed. I searched his name on Google, hoping for a clue, anything. But there was nothing. I felt like I was going crazy. That's when it hit me. He wasn't just a guy I met on Tinder. I had trusted him. I had let myself believe his story. I had sent him money and real money because I thought I was helping him and his dog. I wanted to believe he was telling the truth. And now I had nothing but the cold, hard reality that I had been tricked. I went through all the stages of shock. First, I was angry. Angry at myself for being so gullible, for not seeing the red flags earlier. Then I was scared. I started thinking about how many other people he could have done this to. How many other women he'd manipulated with a sad story and some stock photos. The worst part was realizing that I had let myself fall for it. I'd have trusted him, even after knowing that I didn't really know him at all. The worst part was how personal it felt. It felt like I'd been emotionally invested in someone who was never real. Andy had crafted this perfect story to make me feel sorry for him, to make me want help. And it worked. But once I figured it out, I was left feeling empty. I felt betrayed, but worse than that, I felt stupid. I reported him to Tinder, but of course, nothing came of it. It wasn't like they could do anything about it now. I couldn't get my money back, and I couldn't track him down. He had vanished without a trace. Looking back, I should have known better. I should have done more research before jumping into something like that. But at the time, I just wanted to help. I wanted to believe that there was some kind of good in the world, even in a dating app. I don't know where Andy is now, or if Max ever needed surgery, but I do know one thing. I won't be falling for any more sob stories. I won't be letting my guard down so easily again. Because sometimes the person you think you're helping is just waiting to take advantage of you, and you won't even see it coming. I never thought meeting someone on a dating app could go so wrong. When I first matched with Linda on Hinge, I couldn't believe my luck. She was gorgeous, like model gorgeous. She had these bright blue eyes and a smile that could light up a room. Her profile said she loved hiking, traveling, and trying new foods, all things I was totally into. Her pictures looked like they were straight out of some magazine shoot, so I wasn't surprised when it took her a while to respond. At first, it was just casual chatting, nothing too intense. She seemed cool, but also super busy, which I understood. She mentioned work a lot and how she was always on the go, which made sense. But after a few weeks of texting, I decided to ask if she wanted to meet up in person. I thought we had a good vibe, and I was really looking forward to seeing if she was just as great offline. That's when things started getting weird. She flat out said no. I wasn't sure why, but she gave me some excuse about being too busy with work and how she didn't feel ready to meet just yet. Fair enough, I thought. I didn't push her. But after a couple of weeks of texting, I asked again, and she came up with more reasons, some of which didn't really make sense. I'm super tired this weekend, or I just don't have the time right now. It felt off, but I wasn't about to go crazy over it. People have their reasons, right? But then, one day, a whole month later, I got a message from her. She told me she was at a local Starbucks in town. It was a random Tuesday, and I was actually nearby, just running some errands. I didn't think much of it. I figured it was finally happening. I could meet this beautiful girl who had been so elusive for the past month. I got excited, sent a quick message saying I'd be there in 10 minutes, and rushed over. When I walked into Starbucks, my eyes scanned the place, looking for a stunning girl with bright blue eyes and a killer smile. But I didn't see anyone who fit the bill. There were a couple of people sitting at tables, sipping their drinks, but no one who looked like Linda. I stood there for a minute, kind of confused, and I saw a guy sitting in the corner, looking really out of place. He was older, probably in his mid-40s, with a disheveled appearance. His hair was greasy, and his clothes looked like he hadn't washed them in a few days. His face was tense, and he kept looking at me nervously. Something didn't sit right with me. I walked over to him slowly, trying to figure out what was going on. Maybe he was just waiting for someone. I glanced around again, looking for any signs of Linda. I asked him, "Hey, is there a girl named Linda here?" The guy froze. His eyes widened, and he looked at me like a deer caught in headlights. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and for a moment I thought maybe he hadn't heard me properly. I repeated myself, just a little louder, "Is Linda here?" The girl I was supposed to meet? That's when it happened. He broke. His face turned red, and he mumbled something that I couldn't quite make out. I was starting to get a bad feeling, like maybe this whole thing was some sort of joke. Maybe he was trying to mess with me. But then he said it, and Linda. I'm not sure what exactly went through my mind at that moment. I was in complete disbelief. The guy sitting in front of me, looking like he hadn't showered in days, was apparently the person I had been talking to for the last month. This wasn't the stunning woman I had been imagining. I felt like I was in some kind of weird nightmare. I tried to process it, tried to wrap my head around what he had just said. Was this some kind of catfishing situation? Was he pretending to be a woman the whole time? I felt a mix of anger, confusion, and embarrassment. But most of all, I felt betrayed. For a month, I had been talking to someone who wasn't even close to what they had presented themselves to be. Linda, or whatever his real name was, could see that I was freaking out. He didn't try to explain. He didn't offer any apology. He just sat there, nervously tapping his fingers on the table, like he was waiting for me to say something. But what could I say? I felt trapped. I didn't want to make a scene in public, but I also didn't want to waste another second of my time with this person. My brain was screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't just walk away without saying something. I tried to keep my cool and just calmly asked, "Why would you pretend to be someone else? Why not just be yourself?" He didn't respond. He just stared at me for a long time, like he was calculating his next move. Then, after what felt like an eternity of uncomfortable silence, he shrugged. He said something like, "I was just trying to have a little fun. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This guy had made up a whole persona, led me on for weeks, and I had actually fallen for it. I didn't even know what to feel anymore. Part of me wanted to shout at him, demand an explanation, but the other part of me was just done. I didn't say another word. I turned around and walked out of that Starbucks as fast as I could, trying to hold myself together. My heart was racing, my mind was spinning. I felt humiliated. I couldn't believe I had been so stupid. The whole time I had been texting with him, I thought I was talking to a gorgeous girl who was just a little shy. But no, this guy had been playing me the entire time. By the time I got home, I felt completely drained. I deleted my Hinge profile and blocked the number he had been using. I didn't want anything to do with him, and I didn't want to get involved in whatever strange game he was playing. But the whole experience left me shaken. I couldn't understand why someone would go to such lengths to deceive someone else. What was the point? It wasn't like I had even done anything to deserve being treated like that. I was just looking for a genuine connection, and instead I got caught up in a twisted lie. The weirdest part was how long it took me to figure it out. I kept thinking back to all the red flags I missed. The way he made excuses, the way he seemed to keep postponing our meeting, the weirdness of finally meeting in person. Looking back now, it seems so obvious, but at the time I didn't see it. I'm not sure what happened to him or why he did what he did. But I do know one thing. I'm definitely going to be a lot more careful about who I trust online from now on. I don't think I'll ever really understand why someone would do something like that, but I won't forget how it made me feel. I'm just thankful I walked away before things got even worse. I had always been a bit cautious when it came to online dating, but when a friend of mine recommended Muzmatch, a Muslim dating app, I figured I would give it a try. I mean, it seemed like a good place to meet someone who shared similar values and beliefs. So after browsing through profiles for a while, I matched with Ahmed. Ahmed's profile stood out to me right away. His pictures were charming. He had this warm, inviting smile, and he seemed like someone who genuinely valued family and faith. We started chatting, and it was nice. He was polite, funny, and had a lot of interesting things to say. We talked about our families, our hobbies, and of course, religion. It felt comfortable, like we were building some kind of connection. We talked for about a week before he suggested meeting in person. I was hesitant, but after a little back and forth, I agreed. We decided to meet at a nice cafe in the city, one of those cozy spots with dim lighting and candles on each table. It seemed like the perfect place for a relaxed first meeting. He promised it would be casual, nothing too serious, just a chance to get to know each other better. When I showed up, I immediately spotted him. He was sitting at a table near the window, dressed in a sharp suit. He looked different from his pictures, older, maybe in his early 30s, and a lot more formal than I expected. I assumed he had just wanted to make a good impression, so I didn't think much of it. I walked over, greeted him, and sat down. The conversation started out fine. We talked about work, life, and everything in between. But the longer we talked, the more I began to notice that he was intense, not in a good way. He kept complimenting me on my appearance, on my personality, on my intelligence, but it started to feel forced, like he was trying to convince me of something. He kept talking about how rare it was to find someone like me, how he had been praying for a wife with values like mine, and I started to feel uncomfortable. It was then that he did something that completely threw me off guard. Out of nowhere, he stood up and walked around to my side of the table. I was a little confused, but tried to brush it off as a weird gesture. Then he bent down on one knee. I froze. I thought I was imagining it, but no, he was genuinely on one knee, holding out a small velvet box. My heart raced. He looked up at me, his face full of sincerity. I was so caught off guard I couldn't even breathe. Was this really happening? Was he proposing to me after one date? I don't know what he saw in my face, but it was clear I wasn't responding the way he wanted. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, but inside my mind was spinning. This was crazy, right? I barely knew this guy. I didn't even feel a connection beyond our initial chats. Why would he do this? But he didn't stop there. He opened the box to reveal a massive diamond ring. I had never seen anything so extravagant in my life. It was easily worth thousands of dollars, maybe even more. The kind of ring you would expect someone to buy after months of dating, not a first date. He looked at me waiting for an answer like this was the most natural thing in the world. I started to panic. I didn't know what to say. I felt trapped. I wasn't ready for this kind of commitment. I hadn't even thought about marriage, let alone with the person I just met. My stomach twisted into knots. I tried to process it all, but nothing seemed to make sense. I had to get out of there. The only thing I could do was shake my head. I didn't know how to explain that this wasn't right, that I wasn't ready, that it was way too soon. I said something about needing time, needing to think, but the words didn't seem to land. I felt a mix of fear and confusion. I didn't know how to escape this situation. Ahmed's face fell, but he didn't argue. Instead, he just closed the box and stood up, looking slightly disappointed but not angry. I didn't know if I had broken his heart or if he was just playing it off, but the whole thing felt suffocating. I stood up too, trying to keep my composure. I grabbed my purse, said a quick goodbye, and walked out of the cafe as fast as I could. I didn't look back. I barely made it to the street before I started shaking. My thoughts were racing. I had never felt more uncomfortable in my life. I couldn't understand why he would do something so extreme, so out of nowhere. I didn't know if I was just unlucky or if this was something I should have expected on a dating app. But whatever it was, I wasn't going to stick around to find out. As I walked to my car, I couldn't help but replay the whole scene in my mind. The way he was so confident, the way he seemed so sure of himself. How he thought this huge, expensive ring would somehow make me say yes. It was like he had already decided everything for me without even considering how I might feel. I texted a couple of my friends to tell them what happened. They were just as shocked as I was. Did you even get a chance to breathe before that happened? One of them asked. I hadn't, and it felt like I had just been thrown into a whirlwind. It was a classic case of someone getting way too ahead of themselves, but I also couldn't shake the feeling that something more was off. The whole situation felt like I was just a checkbox on his list, like he didn't really care about getting to know me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how I had been so blindsided by this over-the-top proposal. Was this his way of showing affection? Or was he just playing a game, trying to control the situation from the start? I didn't know, but I was sure of one thing. I wasn't going to put myself in a situation where I felt pressured to say yes to something I wasn't ready for. The next day, I blocked him on the app. I didn't want to hear from him again. It felt like the only way to take control of the situation. I didn't want someone like that in my life, someone who thought they could dictate how things would go without any regard for what I actually wanted. I never heard from him again, and I never looked back. But every time I think about that day, I get this strange feeling. Maybe it was just an isolated incident, but something about it still feels off. I don't know if he really thought he was doing something romantic or if it was all just a manipulation tactic. Either way, it taught me to trust my gut and to take things slow, no matter how perfect someone might seem on paper. And honestly, I'm just glad I walked away when I did. I'd never thought something like this would happen to me. I mean, I heard the horror stories about bad Tinder dates, but I always figured I was smart enough to avoid anything too crazy. But the night I met Katie changed that forever. It all started pretty normally. I matched with her on Tinder a few weeks ago. She was cute, pretty smile, bright eyes, and from what she said in her profile, she seemed to be down to earth and into the same things as me. We chatted for a few days. The usual stuff, talking about hobbies, music, movies, small talk. Eventually, she suggested meeting up at a bar downtown. Nothing too fancy, just a casual night out to grab drinks and chat in person. I was excited, maybe a little nervous. That's normal for a first date, right? I picked a nice, chill bar that wasn't too crowded, but still had a good vibe. I got there a little early, grabbed a drink for myself while I waited, and sent her a message to let her know where I was sitting. She replied saying she'd be there soon, so I just sipped my drink, people watched, and waited. When she finally walked in, I immediately recognized her. She looked just like her pictures, but in real life, she was even more attractive. She smiled and waved at me, and I waved back. I got up, and we greeted each other awkwardly. Well, I did at least. She seemed pretty chill. We grabbed our drinks, sat down, and started talking. For the first 15 minutes or so, everything seemed fine. She was super friendly, easy to talk to, and I thought, hey, this could be something. But then things got weird. Katie had finished her drink, and after I set my glass down, she asked me if I could grab her a straw. I didn't think much of it at first, just assumed she was one of those people who liked to drink with a straw. So I went to the bar and asked the bartender for one. I didn't take long, maybe 2 minutes max, and when I got back to our table, she was waiting with a smile. I handed her the straw and she thanked me. I sat down and took a sip of my drink. But as soon as I did, I felt this odd, almost instant wave of drowsiness hit me. I wasn't drunk, hadn't even had enough to drink for that, but I suddenly felt heavy. My eyelids felt like they were made of lead, and it took everything I had just to keep them open. I tried to focus, tried to keep the conversation going, but my words felt sluggish. It was like my brain was trying to work but couldn't quite catch up. The next thing I remember is feeling everything go dark. When I woke up, I was lying in a hospital bed, the sterile smell of antiseptic filling the air. My head was pounding like a drum, and I could barely move. I looked around, confused, and saw a doctor standing nearby, scribbling something on a clipboard. I tried to sit up, but the doctor gently pushed me back down. "Take it easy," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You've been through a lot." I had no idea what she was talking about, what happened. Why was I in the hospital? The doctor explained that I had been found unconscious at the bar I'd gone to earlier that night. I'd been drugged. Someone had slipped something into my drink. It knocked me out cold. My heart sank. I didn't know what to think. Who would do something like that? And more importantly, why? I still couldn't remember much, but I tried to focus on what she was saying. I kept asking if I could leave, but she told me they wanted to monitor me for a bit longer to make sure I was okay. As I lay there, the reality of the situation started to hit me. I remembered being at the bar with Katie, laughing, chatting, having a good time. Then she asked me for a straw, and that was the last thing I remembered clearly. After that, it all went dark. I felt around for my phone and wallet, a habit when I'm in strange places, but when I checked my pockets, something didn't feel right. My wallet was gone. So was my phone. I felt my stomach drop. I immediately asked the doctor about my belongings, and she seemed confused. She checked around the room, but no wallet or phone was in sight. I tried to stay calm, but I could feel the panic rising in my chest. This wasn't just some random accident. It was intentional. Katie had drugged me. I didn't know what her game was, but it was clear now that she had planned this. I tried to go over the events in my head. The way she had acted so normal, so sweet, and then the way she had asked for a straw. It all seemed calculated now. The drink, the straw. I was starting to put it together. She must have slipped something into my drink before I left to get the straw. That was the only explanation. I spent the next couple of hours in the hospital trying to piece things together, but it didn't help. I was in complete disbelief. How could I have been so stupid? She seemed so normal, so nice. I never once thought she'd do something like this. After I was released from the hospital, I tried to contact the bar to see if they had any security footage. I couldn't believe they didn't have anything that could help me. It felt like a bad dream, like something you see in a movie but never think would actually happen to you. I called my bank too, hoping to cancel any transactions, and they told me there had been several charges made from my accounts, charges I definitely didn't make. The worst part, I went back to my Tinder account to check if she was still active. Of course she was, but she had deleted the conversation we had. Everything was wiped. I knew then that this wasn't just some random incident. This was a well-thought-out scam, and she had gotten away with it. I blocked her immediately and deleted my Tinder profile. I didn't want to risk meeting anyone like that again. The whole situation left me paranoid and skeptical. I don't trust people easily anymore, and I've learned the hard way that not everyone on these apps is who they say they are. I don't know where Katie went or what she planned to do with my stuff, but I'll never forget that night. The night I went on a Tinder date and woke up in a hospital bed, not knowing what happened, with everything I owned taken from me. It's something I'll never forget, and I'll definitely never trust anyone that quickly again. I met Mark on a popular dating app, and at first, everything seemed pretty normal. His profile was simple but charming. He had a couple of pictures, mostly selfies taken outdoors with a big smile, nothing too fancy. His bio was the kind of thing you see a lot, looking for someone to share adventures with kind of vibe. But what really got me was his messages. He was funny, easy to talk to, and didn't feel like he was playing games like some of the guys I'd met before. We talked for a couple of days on the app, and it was cool, nothing strange. Just casual stuff, what we do for work, hobbies, music, that kind of thing. Then, after a few days, he suggested we take it to phone calls. At first, I was hesitant. I mean, you never really know who's on the other end of these things, right? But his messages were so natural, and he seemed genuine enough, so I agreed. The first call went well. His voice was calm, a little deep, but not too deep. It sounded just like you'd expect a guy in his 30s to sound. I wasn't really expecting fireworks or anything, but we got along. We talked about random stuff, joked around, and it felt pretty easy. He didn't seem like a weirdo, so I figured, why not keep it going? The next few calls were just as normal, nothing strange. His voice was smooth, comforting. I started looking forward to our chats. But after a while, I started to notice something weird. And I'll be honest, it took me a while to actually pick up on it. It was subtle at first. I thought maybe I was just imagining it, but every time we spoke, something in his voice sounded just off. At first, it was like he'd occasionally sound a little more tired or a little less energetic, but then it got more noticeable. Some days he'd sound more high-pitched, other days he'd sound like he had a cold. It wasn't huge, but it was enough to make me feel a little weird. I kept thinking, maybe he's just tired, or maybe he's messing with his voice for fun. I mean, some people have weird voices when they're sick or have allergies, right? But then one night, everything changed. I was talking to him, and I noticed it again. His voice was slightly different. But this time, it wasn't just the tone or pitch. It sounded like he was struggling to hold his real voice in place, like he was trying to sound like someone he wasn't. That's when I heard it. I was listening to him talk about some random story, nothing important, just usual small talk. And in the background, I thought I heard something. It was so faint, but it felt like someone was whispering. At first, I thought I imagined it, but then it happened again, clearer this time. A soft voice like it was coming from the other side of the room. It wasn't loud enough for me to make out exactly what was being said, but I could clearly hear the words. He's not who you think he is. My heart dropped. I froze for a second. I'm not the paranoid type, but hearing that from somewhere in the background while I was talking to him made me freak out a little. I tried to stay calm and keep the conversation going, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I had just heard. Was it someone else in the room? Was it a mistake? Or was it some kind of warning? I didn't bring it up to him right away. I kept listening, trying to stay focused on his words, but I couldn't stop thinking about that whisper. After a few more minutes, I decided to confront him. Maybe he'd just explain it away and we'd move on. I asked him if he was alone, and he had some excuse about being at his friend's place and that they were watching a movie. But it didn't sit right with me. I don't know what it was, but something inside me told me I needed to figure this out. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I had to know what was going on. I'd been feeling like there was more to him than I knew, and now that voice in the background was making me doubt everything. The next day, I did some digging. I wasn't expecting much, but I Googled his name and the details he'd given me. I didn't think I'd find anything, but I was wrong. After a couple of minutes of searching, I found something. It wasn't much at first, just some vague posts on a forum from people who mentioned his name in passing. But as I dug deeper, I came across more and more. Apparently, Mark wasn't new to this whole online thing. There were reports of him using different names and photos on several dating apps, and it was clear he wasn't being honest with anyone. His sob stories about family struggles or tough work situations turned out to be recycled from different profiles. Some of the people in these forums even said they'd gotten weird messages from him, where it seemed like he was playing different characters or using fake voices. Some people said they had even met him in person, only to find out the guy they'd been talking to for weeks wasn't the same person who showed up. I kept reading, getting more and more creeped out. It was like this guy had a pattern. He'd create fake identities, build up trust with women, then disappear with their personal information. I felt like I was going crazy. I started piecing it all together. The voice changes, the background whisper, the oddities in his stories. It wasn't just my imagination. This guy was definitely hiding something. And whatever it was big enough to make him want to pretend to be someone he wasn't. I couldn't believe it. The guy I'd been talking to, the one who seemed so charming, so normal, was a fraud. a serial impersonator. He had some kind of twisted need to play these roles, to manipulate people into thinking they knew him, only to discard them when he was done. The person I'd been talking to on the phone wasn't even the real guy. He was just another character in his game. I stopped talking to him after that. It didn't feel safe anymore, and I wasn't about to give him another chance to mess with me. I blocked him on everything. Phone, app, social media. I didn't want to take any chances. Even now, I still get uneasy when I think about that night and everything I uncovered. It's crazy how easy it is for someone to pretend to be something they're not, especially when they're hiding behind a screen. Dating apps can be a dangerous place, and it's easy to get swept up in the excitement of meeting someone new. But now I know better. People aren't always who they say they are, and the next time I get a weird vibe, I'll trust my gut. Jake seemed perfect when we first matched on the app. I remember looking at his profile and thinking, this could be it. His photos were cool, nothing too flashy, just a guy looking like he had his life together. We had a few back and forths through the app, and honestly, I was kind of excited. It felt like I was talking to someone who actually wanted to get to know me, not just a random guy looking for a hookup. Our first date was amazing. We went to this cute little bistro downtown. He was funny, kind, and seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. I felt comfortable around him, like we were already friends. We talked for hours, and by the time the night ended, I couldn't wait to see him again. As time went on, things seemed to get even better. Our second date, we went to a wine bar and stayed until they closed. He'd text me in the mornings, asking how my day was going, and I thought it was sweet. We kept it light, kept it fun. Honestly, I felt like I was getting to know someone who could be a real part of my life. But then, things started to get weird. At first, it wasn't obvious, just little things. He'd send texts at random times, stuff like good morning, or hope you're having a good day, and I didn't mind, because it was cute, right? I mean, he seemed like a guy who just really wanted to keep in touch. But then it started to get a little much. I'd get texts in the middle of the night, like 2 or 3 a.m. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe he couldn't sleep or he was just excited. But after a while, it started to feel overwhelming. I had to tell him I needed space. I wasn't used to this kind of constant communication, and I didn't want to be rude, but I was starting to feel suffocated. I tried to keep it polite, said I needed a little time to focus on work and my own stuff. That's when things took a strange turn. Instead of easing off, Jake seemed to double down. He started texting me even more, even at weird hours like 4 a.m. on weekdays, asking what I was doing. I'd be at work trying to focus, and he'd text me saying things like, "Hey, what's up?" It was starting to bug me. It didn't feel normal. I even started ignoring his messages sometimes, hoping he'd get the hint. But that didn't work. A few days later, I noticed something that really freaked me out. I was at the gym, just finishing up a workout when I saw him. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. I didn't think Jake would even know I went to this gym. It was a local spot, one I'd picked because it was close to my apartment and wasn't too crowded. But there he was walking the treadmill. He smiled at me when he saw me. I just waited and left. It was a little weird, but I didn't think too much of it. Maybe he just started working out there too. But then, a few days later, I saw him again. Same place, same time, like it was planned. I couldn't shake the weird feeling I had. Was he following me? Was this all just some crazy coincidence? I didn't know, but I told myself, no, it's probably just me overthinking. The next time it happened was at my favorite coffee shop. I'd go there most mornings before work to get my coffee, and there he was, sitting at the table next to mine, looking up at me with that same smile. He waved. I could feel my stomach drop. It was starting to feel like I couldn't escape. I made some excuse to leave quickly and went back to work, but now I felt like I was being watched. I tried to brush it off, but that weekend, things took an even weirder turn. I was at my office staying late to finish some work when I got a message from Jake. "Hey, what are you up to?" I looked out my office window and I saw him walking past, looking up at my building. My heart sank. I hadn't told him where I worked. How the hell did he know? It was then that I realized he'd been tracking me. He'd been showing up the places I frequented, and now he was showing up at my work. The only way he could have known all of this was if he was tracking my social media. But I hadn't posted anything about my gym, my coffee shop, or my office. The only way he could have known was if he'd been checking my location somehow. I started going through my phone's settings, checking location tracking, but everything seemed fine. I hadn't given him my phone number until we'd been talking for a while, and I didn't think I'd shared my location with him. But that didn't explain how he knew exactly where I'd be. I didn't know what to do anymore. I was feeling trapped in my own life, like he was always one step behind me. I'd block him on social media, and the next day, I'd get a message from a new number, a new account. I was starting to panic, but I didn't want to make a scene. I was afraid of what he might do. I didn't know how long I could keep avoiding him. Every time I thought I was safe, he'd pop up again. The guy who seemed perfect at first, who I thought I was building a real connection with, turned out to be something completely different. I couldn't escape. I didn't feel safe, and the worst part was, I didn't know how far he would go. The worst thing was realizing that this was happening because I had trusted him. I thought we were on the same page, but in reality, I was just another one of his targets, someone he could track, someone he could control. I had to take steps to protect myself, blocking numbers, changing my routines, keeping my social media private. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting for the next chance to show up. I wish I could say everything ended with me confronting him and everything being okay, but it didn't. I had to keep moving, keep hiding, hoping he'd eventually get tired of his twisted game. I don't know what would happen if I didn't start paying attention, but it's one of the scariest things I've ever been through. It's weird how you can feel safe one minute and then be trapped the next. So, I matched with this guy named Ben on Tinder, and at first, it seemed like just another regular conversation. We talked for a few days, and we really clicked. Like, we had so many of the same interests, similar hobbies, and even the same taste in music. We were diving into deep conversations about life, goals, and the little things, and it felt way more genuine than any other conversations I'd had on the app. It was almost like I had met someone who was on the same wavelength as me. Eventually, after a few weeks of texting and FaceTiming, we decided to meet up. I'd gotten so comfortable with him, and he seemed like such a great guy. There were no red flags, at least not on the surface. We agreed to meet at this cute little cafe downtown. I was nervous, of course, because meeting someone in real life for the first time is always a little awkward, but I had a good feeling about him. So the day comes and I get there early. I'm sitting at the table, checking my phone, just trying to kill time. I'm not really sure what I'm expecting, but I guess I thought he looked somewhat like his photos. I mean, I know people can be a little more polished online, but it shouldn't be that different, right? I keep looking around, and then I spot him walking in. At first, I didn't recognize him. It wasn't until he smiled and waved that something hit me. I could see it in his eyes. That familiar, unsettling feeling started creeping in. He looked exactly like my ex, like down to the smallest details, the same nose, the same hair, even the way he walked. I froze. I didn't know how to process it. I felt like I was seeing a ghost, but at the same time, I thought, no, there's no way this could be real. My ex and I had broken up a while ago, and I hadn't even been thinking about him much. But here was Ben with this perfect copy of his face. It was so strange. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was just overthinking it. We sat down, and the conversation started normally enough. He was charming, funny, and still seemed to be the guy I had been talking to for the past few weeks. But then things started to get weird. It wasn't just the way he looked, it was the things he said. He was making comments about things I had only ever told my ex. Little details like the way I liked my coffee, my old job, places I used to go with him. I'd brush it off as coincidence, but as the night went on, it started to feel more and more unsettling. He was saying things like he knew me in ways that felt way too familiar. The whole time I tried to focus on the conversation, but my mind kept drifting. I kept thinking, this can't be happening. I even asked him once about his past, and he gave me these vague answers that didn't quite line up, like he was avoiding the question. But why would he? It wasn't like we were talking about anything crazy. It felt like he was holding something back. Then came the tipping point. At one point, Ben mentioned something that only my ex would have known, something so specific that it made my stomach drop. He talked about this trip I took to the beach, the one where I broke my leg and had to stay in a cast for weeks. It was a traumatic time for me, and no one but my ex would have known about it. He was the one who took care of me during that whole ordeal, and yet Ben was casually bringing it up like it was no big deal. I felt this sudden rush of panic. My heart started racing, and my hands felt cold. I couldn't sit there pretending anymore. Something wasn't right, and I needed answers. I had to ask him. I needed to know what was going on. I asked if he had ever been in a relationship before or if he'd ever been to the places he had mentioned. He kept dodging my questions, giving me half answers and acting like it was no big deal. But I could tell he was getting nervous, like I was getting too close to something. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of trying to piece things together, I just confronted him flat out. "Are you really Ben?" I asked. The way he reacted confirmed everything. He paused, his face going pale, and then he let out a laugh that didn't sound genuine at all. He said, "It's complicated," like that was supposed to explain everything. And then he dropped the bombshell. He wasn't just Ben. He was my ex, using a fake profile to get back into my life. He admitted that he had been pretending to be someone else so he could get me and meet him again. He had stalked me for weeks, found my new social media accounts, and even gone so far as to create a new persona just to get close to me. All those things he had said, all those coincidences from our past, they weren't coincidences at all. I felt like my world was crashing down around me. The guy I had been talking to for the past month, the one I thought was charming and interesting, had been my ex all along. I felt disgusted, betrayed. I didn't know how to react, how to process the fact that I had been duped. He had made me think I was getting to know someone new, someone better, but it turned out he was the same manipulative person I had already escaped from once. I didn't stick around for the rest of the conversation. I stood up, grabbed my things, and walked out of the cafe. He called after me, but I didn't look back. I didn't want to hear whatever excuse he had left. It wasn't like it mattered. I knew everything I needed to know. I don't know what I was expecting when I opened up the app that day. Maybe I thought it would be just another date with a guy who was nice enough. But instead, I got something far worse. A nightmare I hadn't seen coming. And now I'm left questioning everything I thought I knew about people trust, and how easily someone can slip back into your life if you're not paying attention. But one thing's for sure, I'm never using that weird dating app again. Oh, Bumble, what a weird place, I'll tell you that much. I have to admit, the guy I met, Ethan, seemed perfect at first. He was sweet, attentive, and made me feel like I was the most important person in his world. We talked for hours about everything, what we liked to do, our past experiences, what we wanted for the future. We had so much in common, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on the right track. He wasn't pushy, didn't rush things, just patient and thoughtful. I figured maybe this is the real thing. At first, everything was great. He would send me cute little gifts. Nothing extravagant, just little tokens that showed he was paying attention. Like one time, he sent me a book I had mentioned wanting to read a few weeks ago, or a candle that smelled like my favorite coffee shop. I thought it was sweet, thoughtful, and just the right amount of effort. I was falling for it, falling for him. But then it got weird. It started small. At first, I thought it was just him being, well, him. Sweet, attentive, the kind of person who remembers things. He started sending me photos from our dates, saying things like, "I love how you looked that night," or "I love how happy you looked when we went to that coffee shop together." I didn't think too much about it until he started bringing up things I hadn't mentioned in days. Things I hadn't even realized he was paying attention to. Like one time I mentioned I like a certain type of tea, and the next time we met, he had the exact brand waiting for me. I mean, okay, that's nice, right? But it felt like he was tracking things about me. And that's when the weirdness started creeping in. It wasn't just the gifts or the photos anymore. It was the way he would talk about past dates. He'd text me in the middle of the day and say things like, "Remember when we went to that park last week? You looked so cute in that dress." Or he'd randomly comment, "I was thinking about that time we went to that Italian restaurant," and he tried to guess all the pasta names. These weren't casual comments. They were specific, like he was trying to capture every little detail of our time together, preserving it like some kind of scrapbook. It was no longer about enjoying the moment. It was like he was building this perfect picture of our relationship. The strangest thing was how he would bring up memories that didn't seem to make sense. One time he texted me saying, "You've grown so much since we first met. You're so much more confident now." I didn't know what he was talking about. I hadn't really felt any different, but suddenly he was talking about me like he had been watching me change. And it wasn't just physical. He was commenting on how I'd grown emotionally, mentally. It felt like he was marking milestones in my life that only he could see. But how could he see that? We'd only been talking for a few weeks. How could he know what had changed in me? It wasn't just words anymore. He started showing up at places I hadn't mentioned to him. One day, I went to a local library, and when I walked in, I saw him sitting at a table, reading a book I had mentioned wanting to check out a few days ago. And he was just there. Not like a coincidence, but like he knew exactly where I'd be. It wasn't like I told him, "Hey, I'm going to the library today." No, he had found me there, and it made me feel like I was being followed, like he was tracking my every move. I tried to play it off, acting like it was just a coincidence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how much Ethan seemed to be obsessing over me, over the details of my life. The more he collected pieces of me, the more uncomfortable I became. At first, it seemed innocent, sweet even, but as the days went by, I started feeling suffocated. It wasn't normal for someone to pay this much attention to every little thing you said or did. He was trying to capture the essence of who I was, like a project, not a relationship. One night, I was scrolling through some old texts, and it hit me. He had been collecting everything, not just about the dates we had, but about my life, about me. The things I'd mentioned offhand, my childhood memories, my favorite places to eat, my dreams and fears, he had been holding onto those like they were precious pieces of information. It wasn't just me he was interested in anymore. It was like he was obsessed with who I was, every tiny detail of my life. The more I thought about it, the more scared I got. It was like I wasn't just a person to him anymore. I was his project, his experiment. I started thinking about the things he had said, the way he made me feel like I was special and unique, like no one else could understand me the way he did. I realized then that he wasn't just trying to build a relationship with me. He was building an ideal version of me in his head, one that he could mold and shape however he wanted. I felt trapped. I was scared to confront him about it because I didn't even know what to say. It wasn't like he had done anything bad on the surface. He hadn't hurt me. He hadn't been malicious, but I felt like I was slowly losing myself in this twisted version of reality he was creating for us. It was like I wasn't in control anymore. The last straw came when I found a notebook in his apartment one night. I was sitting on his couch waiting for him to get ready for dinner, and I noticed a little black notebook peeking out from under a pile of papers. Out of curiosity, I opened it. It was full of handwritten notes about me, about things I'd said in passing, memories I had forgotten about, things I hadn't realized he was paying attention to. It was like he had been writing my life down as if he was cataloging every moment we shared. I didn't know what to think. I didn't know how to react. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. This wasn't love. This was obsession. I wasn't just dating someone anymore. I was being consumed piece by piece. I left that night. I told him I needed space, that I wasn't ready for a relationship, and I never looked back. I blocked his number, deleted his profile, and erased all the traces he left behind. But the memories of him, of how he tried to control every aspect of my life, how he was collecting pieces of me like some kind of twisted project, still haunt me. And now every time I think about dating again, I wonder how many people out there are just like Ethan, waiting to collect someone like they're a trophy, not a person. This is my uncomfortable dating app horror story. I met Chris on Hinge, and at first, everything seemed pretty much perfect. I mean, I'd been on a few dates before, but none of them ever really clicked like this one did. He was charming, caring, and just made me feel really special. We hit it off right away. We would talk for hours on end, sharing silly stories and talking about our dreams and goals for the future. Honestly, I thought I had finally met someone genuine. We went on a few more dates, and everything felt natural. No red flags, no weird vibes, just two people really connecting. Or at least, that's what I thought. Then things started to get strange. It wasn't anything major at first, just little things that made me feel like I was being watched. At first, I thought it was just my imagination running wild. One morning, I woke up to a text from an unknown number. The message was weird. I see you're with him now. I thought it was just some random spam, but then I got another one a few days later. You two look good together. Okay, that was odd, right? But I brushed it off, thinking it was nothing. But then it got worse. The messages became more frequent, and they were starting to feel way too personal. The tone was definitely off. Whoever was sending them knew things about me and Chris that they shouldn't have. At first, I was freaked out but figured it was just a weird coincidence. I mean, this stuff happens all the time, right? The real turning point came when I was at work one day. I'd just gotten back from lunch when I noticed a woman standing in front of the building, just kind of staring. I thought it was odd, but again, I didn't think much of it. But then, a few days later, she was at my gym. I noticed her from the corner of my eye when I was on the treadmill, and she was just standing there, watching me. I didn't know what to do. It felt off, but I figured it was just my nerves. That night, when I got home, I checked my phone and saw another message from the unknown number. I saw you at the gym today. Nice outfit. My stomach dropped. That was it. It wasn't just a coincidence anymore. Someone was following me. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I told Chris about the messages, and he seemed genuinely concerned. He reassured me that it was probably just someone with too much time on their hands, but it didn't feel like just some random person. The messages were too specific. Whoever was behind them knew too much. Then things took an even creepier turn. One evening, I was getting out of my car when I noticed someone standing by the bushes near my apartment building. It was the same woman from my work and the gym. She was just staring at me. I froze. She didn't say anything, but her eyes were locked on mine, and I felt this cold, creeping fear wash over me. I rushed inside, locking the door behind me, my heart racing. That night, I couldn't sleep. I was terrified. I kept thinking about the woman. Was she stalking me? Was she dangerous? And why did she seem so familiar? I decided to do some digging. I went through my social media looking for any clues. That's when I stumbled upon a few old posts that seemed to hint at a connection between Chris and this woman. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but then I found a photo of Chris and her standing together at what looked like some sort of party. I had zoomed in, and it hit me. Her name was Melanie. I felt this heavy knot form in my stomach as I realized what was going on. Melanie wasn't some random stranger, she was Chris' ex, and from the looks of it, she wasn't over him. Not by a long shot. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe it was just an old relationship that she hadn't quite moved on from. But then, as I looked deeper, I found more evidence. Posts where Chris was tagged, pictures of them together, dates that lined up. This wasn't just some one-off thing. She had been following his life after their breakup, and now it looked like she had turned her focus on me. I started connecting the dots. The weird messages, the random sightings, the way she seemed to show up wherever I was. Melanie had been stalking me. It wasn't just about Chris anymore. It was about making me feel uncomfortable, making me feel unsafe in places where I should have felt the most comfortable. And the worst part was that Chris had known about it. He had known this whole time. I felt betrayed. I was angry, confused, and scared all at once. How could he have kept something like this from me? He had never mentioned Melanie, never said a word about her when we were talking. I had trusted him, and now I felt like I had been lied to from the very beginning. I confronted him about it the next time we saw each other. The conversation was intense, and he admitted that Melanie had been obsessing over him after their breakup. But what he didn't tell me was just how bad it had gotten. He didn't tell me about all the times she'd shown up at his apartment, how she'd hacked his social media accounts, or how she had even tried to manipulate him into getting back together with her. He hadn't told me how she had been showing up at random places, lurking in the background like a shadow, watching every move he made. And now she was turning that obsession onto me. I felt completely blindsided. The guy I had been dating had been hiding this dark, twisted part of his life from me. And now, because of his silence, I was tangled up in it too. I had no idea what Melanie was capable of, and I wasn't about to find out. It didn't take long before I made the decision to cut ties with Chris. I couldn't keep seeing someone who had allowed all of this to happen. And honestly, I didn't want to be anywhere near someone whose ex was capable of stalking me. It wasn't just an awkward ex-girlfriend situation. It was dangerous. After I ended things with Chris, I took extra precautions. I changed my phone number, locked down my social media, and kept my distance from places I'd normally visit. Melanie wasn't someone I wanted to mess with. I didn't know what she was capable of, but I wasn't willing to take any chances. In the end, it was a scary, disturbing experience that I'll never forget. The worst part, I still don't know how deep Melanie's obsession with Chris really went, and the thought of her still lurking out there, watching my every move, is something I'll never get over. I matched with Elliot on a dating app, and at first, everything seemed perfect. He was charming, smart, and shared so many of my interests. We bonded over our favorite books, indie music, and even our quirky sense of humor. Honestly, I thought I had found someone who was exactly my type. We chatted for weeks, sending long messages late into the night about everything from the best coffee shops in town to our dream vacations. It was so easy, like we already knew each other. After a while, we decided to meet in person. I was excited but nervous, like anyone would be when they've been talking to someone online for so long. We agreed on a cozy Italian place downtown, and I arrived early, trying to calm my nerves. When he walked in, I almost couldn't believe how he looked just like his photos. That sounds weird, but you know how sometimes people look nothing like their profile pictures. Elliot was just as cute, if not better. He had a smile that made me feel instantly comfortable, and the chemistry between us was undeniable. We sat down, and the conversation was flowing like we'd been friends for years. We laughed about the same things, shared the same quirky opinions, and even our taste in food seemed to align perfectly. The whole night felt surreal, like a scene from a rom-com where everything falls into place. I remember thinking, wow, this is it. This is exactly what I've been looking for. He was smart, funny, and incredibly easy to talk to. I couldn't believe how well we clicked. But then, about halfway through dinner, something happened that made me feel uneasy. I noticed that Elliot was texting under the table, his eyes darting down every few seconds. It wasn't like he was casually checking his phone. It was like he was hiding something. I tried to brush it off at first, thinking it was just an emergency or something unrelated to me. But after a few minutes, the nagging feeling in my stomach wouldn't go away. I decided to ask him about it. He smiled nervously when I asked if I had caught him in the act, and quickly said, "Oh, it's nothing. Just a friend I'm talking to." His voice had a little too much of a high-pitched tone, and for some reason that made me feel even more suspicious. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, so I let it slide and tried to get back to our conversation. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the night went on, I started to notice more little things that didn't add up. Like when I told him about a trip I'd taken to a local beach last summer, he mentioned a specific detail that I had never shared with him. It wasn't anything huge, just a small memory about the trip, but it made me realize that he knew more about my life than he should have. And then there was the way he seemed to know exactly what I liked, down to the smallest details, like the fact that I preferred dark chocolate over milk chocolate, or that I hated cilantro. The whole thing started to feel more like he was studying me than just getting to know me. After the date ended, I couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I figured I was just being paranoid and overthinking things, so I tried to move on and not let it bother me. The next day, he messaged me again, just like usual, asking if I wanted to hang out sometime soon. The thing was, the more we talked, the more uncomfortable I started to feel. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then, a couple of days later, I found out exactly what that something was. I was talking to a friend of mine when she casually mentioned that she had seen Elliot on a different dating app. At first, I thought she was just mistaken, but then she told me the name of the app, Tinder. I was in complete shock. I couldn't believe it. He was still active on that app while we were talking. I didn't know what to think. Was I just a backup plan to him? Was he using me to pass time while he found someone else? But it didn't end there. The next time we hung out, something even creepier happened. He was still acting like everything was normal, but he kept dropping these little hints like he was too familiar with my life. I mean, it was things like asking about my past relationships or referencing personal stories that he couldn't have known unless he had been talking to someone else about them. And then it hit me. He wasn't just chatting with me. He was sending my personal details to someone else. Later, I decided to dig a little deeper. I went through my messages with him and started piecing together some of the things he'd said. I realized that the things he was telling me weren't his own words. They were things that had been shared with him, probably by someone else. He'd been copying what I'd said to him and sending it to someone else. I couldn't believe it. He wasn't just dating me, he was playing me against someone else. He was using my life to feed into a completely different relationship. It felt like betrayal had hit me in a way I didn't know was possible. I confronted him, but of course, he denied everything and even tried to turn it around on me, saying that I was being paranoid. He claimed that the reason he'd known things about my life was because we'd shared them on our dates. But I knew better. I knew he wasn't just interested in me. He was using me as a stepping stone for whatever game he was playing. That's when I realized that I wasn't just some girl he was casually dating. I was part of a bigger scheme, a project for him to collect information and feed it to whoever else he was talking to. He was pretending to be this perfect guy, but the truth was he had been juggling multiple women, using us for whatever he could get. And that was just one of the perfect matches in his collection. I ended things right there. I couldn't be a part of that twisted game any longer. But even though I ended it, I kept getting messages from him, apologizing and saying he didn't mean to hurt me. I stopped reading them after a while, but the feeling of being deceived stuck with me for a long time. The worst part, I still had no idea how many other people he was talking to like this. I thought I had found someone who was perfect for me, but in reality, Elliot was just perfect at hiding his true intentions. Hello, fellow folks. I met this guy, Dylan, on Facebook a few months ago. He looked like your classic rich businessman. Handsome, confident, and always posting pictures from expensive trips to places like Monaco and Paris. His profile was full of images of luxury cars, private jets, and exclusive parties. At first, I thought he was probably just one of those guys who posts too much on social media to show off, but his messages were charming and really thoughtful. He told me he was successful, owned several luxury properties, and even ran his own company. He seemed like the kind of guy who had his life together, and for the first time in a while, I was actually intrigued. We started chatting more, and honestly, he seemed perfect. He was kind, attentive, and always made an effort to make me feel special. After a few weeks, he invited me to dinner at a private restaurant he claimed was a place he had connections with. It sounded pretty fancy, and since I'd gotten to know him pretty well by then, I thought, why not? Plus, who doesn't love a fancy night out? The night of the dinner, I dressed up a bit, excited for what seemed like a glamorous evening. Dylan sent me the location, this private estate out of the countryside. It seemed a little odd, but the way he talked about it made it sound like this was one of those exclusive, high-end places you had to be someone important to get into. When I arrived, I was greeted by a valet who directed me inside. The house was massive, all sleek modern architecture with large windows, and everything looked way too perfect to be real. The moment I stepped inside, I felt off. There was an odd energy to the place, like it wasn't just a normal restaurant or even a typical private dinner. The room I was led into was dimly lit, with a long table set for a small group. There were about 6 people seated already, well-dressed, quiet, and all staring at me like they were expecting someone important to arrive. It was the kind of attention that made me feel like I was a guest of honor, but it also felt weirdly intense. Dylan was already seated at the head of the table, smiling at me like he was pleased with my arrival. He stood up to greet me, and I tried to shake off that uneasy feeling. It was just dinner, I told myself. The other guests didn't say a word. They just smiled and nodded as I took my seat. Dylan started talking to me about his latest travels and how he had been really focused on his philanthropic lifestyle lately. It all sounded a little rehearsed, but I just assumed he was one of those guys who loved talking about his good deeds and success. As the night went on, though, I started to realize something was wrong. Dylan began to preach about the power of the mind and how we are all trapped in our physical bodies, but we can transcend all of that. It felt like a TED talk, but with this strange, almost cult-like vibe to it. The other guests were nodding along like they had heard this all before, and I started to get the sense that maybe this wasn't just a fancy dinner. It was something way weirder. As the night wore on, I could feel a weird tension building. Dylan kept talking about transcendence and how he had found the key to unlocking our true potential. But then he said something that made my stomach drop. He talked about how this dinner was part of an initiation ceremony. The guests weren't just there for a nice meal. They were followers, and they were there to welcome me into their family. I thought I was hearing things. This was a cult. I didn't know how to react. My mind was spinning, and I tried to stay calm, telling myself I'd just leave and get out of there as soon as I could. But then, as Dylan kept speaking, it hit me. I wasn't just a guest. They were looking at me like I was the chosen one, whatever that meant. They'd been tracking my online presence and decided I was a perfect person to join their society. This wasn't a dinner. It wasn't a philanthropic gathering, as he told me. It was some kind of initiation, and I had been lured right into the middle of it. I tried to leave, to stand up and walk out of the room, but Dylan and the others stopped me. The way they spoke, so calm and eerily collected, made my heart race. They insisted that I join them, that I was meant for something greater. I knew I needed to get out of there before things got worse, but just as I was about to stand up, they told me something that chilled me to my core. They had been watching me for weeks. They knew where I worked, where I went to school, even details about my family and friends that I never posted online. They had been tracking me, getting to know me from my social media presence, and now they were trying to pull me into whatever this was. I somehow managed to leave, my heart pounding in my chest. But as I stepped out into the night, I felt like I had narrowly escaped something terrifying. I got in my car and left as fast as I could, shaking with anxiety. But that wasn't the end of it. The next day, I woke up to dozens of messages from Dylan. He said things like, "Your destiny is calling, and the family is waiting for you." He wouldn't stop messaging me, telling me I couldn't leave, that I had a purpose in this family. It was like he was trying to brainwash me, convincing me that I couldn't walk away from whatever this was. I blocked him, but the messages kept coming from different accounts. Things only got weirder from there. Over the next few days, I started noticing people from my past acting strange, friends, coworkers, even my own family. They'd look at me differently, like they knew something I didn't. One of my friends kept asking me if I'd thought about the family and whether I'd made up my mind. It felt like they were in on something, like I had somehow stumbled into a dangerous web that I couldn't untangle. I don't know what Dylan's game is or what he and his followers want, but I'm terrified that I'm now caught in something bigger than I ever imagined. Every time I check my phone, I see more messages from him, more cryptic threats that I can't escape this destiny. And now I can't help but wonder, are the people around me really who they say they are, or have they all been pulled into this thing too? This whole thing is a nightmare, and I'm just trying to figure out how to break free before it's too late. But right now, I'm not sure who to trust. Dylan's family is everywhere, and I'm scared they're not done with me yet. Guys, I need to get this out there because I'm still having trouble wrapping my head around what happened. So this is what went down. A few weeks ago, I matched with this guy named Liam on a dating app. His profile was full of adventure, skydiving, traveling, living in these insanely expensive apartments, all the usual stuff that made him seem like the perfect guy. He looked like he was living the dream. Honestly, I figured he was one of those people who had it all together. He seemed charming, funny, and super confident, so I thought, why not? I'd always liked meeting new people, and he seemed to have a lot in common with me, so we hit it off pretty easily. After chatting for a while, he invited me over to his place for a casual movie night. I'm not gonna lie, I was kind of excited. It seemed low-key enough. He lived in a really nice building in the city, and I figured it would be one of those chill, comfortable nights where we could hang out, talk, and maybe have a few drinks. Plus, the idea of seeing more of his adventures was kind of cool. He had so many stories about places he'd been, stuff he'd done. When I showed up, everything seemed normal at first. His apartment was exactly what I expected. Big, modern, with all the high-end touches. He even had one of those fancy home theater systems with a projector. We sat down, and things were fine for the first couple of hours. We talked about movies, travel, and just random stuff. But then the questions started getting weird. At first, it was just small talk, but then he asked me some questions that felt a little invasive. He wanted to know about my past, like whether I'd ever been in trouble with the law or had any personal scandals. It was kind of odd, but I didn't think too much about it at the time. People get curious, right? I figured he was just trying to get to know me better. But the more we talked, the more I realized he was asking questions that didn't really make sense. Like he was zeroing in on parts of my past that didn't seem relevant to anything, especially the stuff that I don't usually talk about with people I've just met. But whenever I brushed it off. Then, about 3 hours into the night, Liam suddenly stopped the conversation and grabbed his phone. I didn't think anything of it at first, but then he turned the screen towards me and showed me something that completely freaked me out. It was a photo of my social media profile. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, like he maybe just seen my profile before. But then he swiped to the next image, and it was a video I posted years ago. A video I had completely forgotten about. It was from a road trip I took with my friends, and honestly, it was embarrassing. I was drunk, acting stupid, and doing something I would never want anyone to see again. I tried to laugh it off, but inside, I felt my stomach drop. Then he kept going. Another photo from my Facebook. A post I made about a party I went to in college. Some screenshots from a few DMs I thought had long been buried. And it wasn't just stuff I had put out there publicly. It was stuff from private messages. My heart started pounding. I didn't know how he had these, but it was clear he was stalking me. And that's when the real horror set in. Liam looked at me with this weird, cold smile and said something that I'll never forget. I've been keeping a collection of moments like these from a lot of people I meet. It's amazing what people will put online without thinking. He paused for a second, like he was gauging my reaction. And if you don't help me with a little business proposal, all of these photos and videos, all of your past, well, it's going to go public. I can make sure every single person you know sees it. I just stared at him, trying to process what was happening. It was like a punch in the gut. I had no idea what he meant by business proposal, but I knew it couldn't be good. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just some weird thing he was doing for kicks. He was blackmailing me. He had been stalking people on dating apps, collecting personal info, and using it to control them, to get them to do whatever he wanted. It got worse from there. Liam wasn't just talking about me. He showed me more photos, more embarrassing personal stuff from other people. He was running some kind of sick operation where he collected things from people he met and used it to manipulate them into doing favors or giving him money. I was just another name on a long list of people he had been tracking, gathering dirt on. I was terrified. There was no way I was the only person he was doing this to, but I didn't know how deep this thing ran. At that point, I was seriously trying to figure out how to get out of there without making him flip out. I didn't know what he wanted from me, but I could tell he wasn't going to stop with just me. He said that if I didn't comply, my entire life could be ruined. The thought of him sending my personal stuff to everyone I knew, everyone I cared about, it made me sick. But I wasn't about to let him win. I had to get out of there, so I started playing along. I acted like I was interested in his business proposal and pretended to agree to whatever he was asking, but inside I was freaking out. I didn't know what he expected from me, but I wasn't about to give him anything. I needed time to figure this out to plan. I kept nodding, pretending like everything was fine while mentally trying to think of an escape plan. I was so close to just running out of there, but I didn't want to provoke him. Eventually, I made some excuse about needing to leave, and somehow he let me go. The whole night felt like a nightmare, and I wasn't sure how I'd even gotten out of there in one piece. I'm still freaking out. I blocked him on everything, but who knows if he's still out there collecting info from people. He has so much on me, stuff that I thought was long gone, and the thought of him using it against me, or worse, finding other people to blackmail, makes my skin crawl. The worst part, I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one. I'm sure he's doing this to other people. If you're on dating apps or social media, be careful who you trust. You never know who's watching, and I learned it the hard way. Okay, this all started on a dating app. I matched with this guy, Evan, who seemed pretty chill at first. He had this whole laid-back vibe, said he loved photography, hiking, and traveling to remote places. His photos were all about nature, mountain peaks, lakes at sunset, stuff that made me feel like he was living the dream. We had great conversations. He was one of those people who seemed so easygoing and down to earth, like a guy who could talk about anything without being weird or awkward. We talked about doing a weekend trip together, just the two of us, and I thought it sounded like a cool idea. Why not, right? New adventure, getting to know someone in a laid-back environment, exploring some of the outdoors I love. Plus, I didn't really have any red flags going off. So, Evan invited me to a weekend getaway at this cabin he'd rented out. He promised we'd be going to some really beautiful remote spots outside of town and away from the noise. I was down for the idea of getting away from everything for a couple of days. When I showed up, everything looked perfect. The cabin was cozy with big windows that overlooked a dense forest. There was this peaceful, isolated vibe, the kind of place where you could just unplug and forget about the world. I thought it was going to be a chill weekend. I thought it was going to be exactly what I needed. The first day was exactly as expected. Evan was super easy to talk to, and we went for a long hike. Took some photos, just spent time outside. It was amazing. The views were incredible, and Evan seemed to be enjoying every second of it. But then things started to get weird. It wasn't anything huge at first, just small things that didn't sit right with me. Evan started giving me strange rules. He'd say things like, make sure you don't leave the cabin alone, or stay within sight of me if you go outside. At first, I just brushed it off, thinking maybe he was just being cautious. I mean, we were in the middle of nowhere, and there was no one around. I didn't really think much of it. But then he got more specific. He told me I shouldn't go near the edge of the property, like there was something I shouldn't see. He'd watch me all the time, even when I was just walking around the cabin. It was like he was hovering. And the more I thought about it, the more it started to make me uncomfortable. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I figured I had to be overthinking it, right? Maybe he was just super into making sure everything went perfectly, like maybe he was just really into control. I didn't know him well enough to judge, but something was definitely off. As the night went on, things got worse. He started insisting I stay inside with him after dinner. He kept talking about his photography work and how perfect the cabin was for taking pictures of the night sky, but I could tell he was trying to keep me from leaving. At one point, I wanted to step outside just to get some air, but he immediately said no, that I shouldn't go out there alone. I didn't really have an excuse to go, but the way he said it felt off, like there was something more he wasn't telling me. I figured I'd stay the night and leave in the morning, but by then, I had this weird gut feeling that I couldn't shake. I was trying to ignore it, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I mean, it was a weekend getaway in the mountains. How dangerous could it be? But when I woke up the next morning, things were way more intense. Evan told me that I needed to stay inside while he went out for a bit to take photos. He said he'd be right back, but something in the way he said it made me uneasy. I didn't like the idea of being left alone in this remote cabin, but I didn't want to be rude either. I stayed inside, tried to relax, but my mind kept racing. When Evan came back a couple of hours later, he didn't seem like himself. He was acting a little more intense, his mood was darker. It was almost like he was flipping a switch from the chill, nature-loving guy I'd met to someone different. He said something that I can't forget. "You're the perfect one, you know. I knew it when I found you. You're just what I've been looking for." That's when I realized what was happening. This wasn't a weekend getaway. This wasn't a romantic trip. I was stuck. Evan wasn't who he said he was. This whole thing had been a trap. He wasn't some laid-back, adventurous guy who wanted to share his love of nature with me. He was a psycho who had lured me here to control me, to trap me in this isolated place. I wasn't some random girl he liked on a dating app. No, I was his perfect candidate. Someone he could manipulate, someone he could keep in his twisted world, just like he'd done with other people before me, probably. I started looking for ways to escape, but it was clear he wasn't going to let me leave. Every time I tried to make an excuse or suggested going home early, he shut me down, acting like it was a big deal that I didn't want to stay. He even told me that I needed to trust him, that he was just protecting me. That's when I realized that if I didn't get out of there, I might never get out. He was trying to keep me as his prisoner, but not in some obvious physical way. He was trying to break me down mentally, control every part of me. He'd be inside his twisted version of reality. I won't go into everything that happened next, but I managed to make my move when he wasn't looking. I grabbed my things, snuck out of the cabin, and ran. I don't know how far I got, but I kept going until I got on a road and flagged down a car. I don't even know if Evan knew I was gone until later, but by then I didn't care. I had to get away. I can't even explain the kind of fear I felt the whole time I was there. The worst part, I don't even know if I'll ever feel safe again. He was in my head, controlling me in ways I didn't see coming. And as for Evan, I don't know what he's still capable of, but I have a bad feeling that this wasn't his first time doing this. So, if you ever get an invite for a romantic weekend getaway in a cabin in the middle of nowhere, don't just go because it sounds fun. Trust your gut, because sometimes what seems like an adventure could turn into your worst nightmare. I never thought a dating app could lead to anything like this. It was just supposed to be another casual connection, one of those moments where you talk to someone for a while, maybe meet up. And if you click, great. If not, you move on. But this one with Ella, well, it didn't go like that at all. Ella was different. She was an artist, a quirky, sweet soul who seemed to get my vibe instantly. She loved painting, vintage photography, and this part always made me smile. She was into paranormal. I mean, who wouldn't want to talk about haunted houses, ghost stories, and the strange things that go bump in the night? Honestly, she seemed like my perfect match. Her texts were always thoughtful, she had a certain creativity about her, and she was just really easy to talk to. After a few weeks of chatting, she invited me over to her house for a private art show. I was kind of intrigued, not gonna lie. The way she described it made it sound like something out of a movie, or at least something special. So I agreed. I showed up at her place one Friday evening, my curiosity piqued. Her house was different. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect someone to live in their 20s. The first thing that hit me was how eclectic it was. Old furniture mixed with modern pieces, dark wood floors, and an odd blend of the artsy and spooky. It wasn't creepy exactly, but it was definitely eccentric. There were paintings everywhere, some beautiful, some strange. A lot of vintage photographs that had this timeless vibe to them. Some of the rooms even had strange knickknacks, like antique clocks and old mirrors that almost felt out of place. The vibe was eerie, but in a way that felt charming too. She led me through the house, showing off her work. The paintings were incredible, but as we went through the rooms, I started noticing something odd. The pictures on the walls, they all featured her, but the strangest part was that in each photo, there was another person with her. Someone I didn't recognize, but the guy, he looked like me. The first few times I brushed it off. Maybe it was just a weird coincidence, like a certain style of photo she liked to use. But then I started seeing more and more of these photos. Each one had her and some guy in it, and each time, it looked more and more like I was seeing myself in the background. At first, I thought I was just imagining it. When I asked her about it, she smiled, but there was this weird, almost sad look in her eyes. She told me about a guy named Cully, someone she had been in a relationship with before. He was apparently this amazing, talented guy who had tragically passed away in a car accident 2 years ago. As she talked about him, her voice was soft, but there was something in her tone, something that didn't sit right with me. It wasn't just mourning, it was like she was still living in this world with him. She talked about Gully as if he was still part of her life, even though she claimed he was dead. As we kept walking through the house, the photos kept popping up and I couldn't stop noticing them. There was something eerie about the way Ella described Gully. She mentioned him like he was still around, like he was just out of the room, or maybe he was somewhere nearby. She even referred to the paintings on the walls like they were portraits of him. That's when it hit me. The guy in the photos, he wasn't me. He was Gully. And for some reason, I started to feel like I was being put in his shoes, like maybe this whole thing was just some weird setup to get me into a place where I could take his place. But no, that didn't make sense, right? I started looking around at the rest of the house. Everything about the place started to feel more and more off. The room we were in had these old mirrors, the kind that seemed to reflect things a little too clearly, too perfectly. I don't know if it was the lighting or the way she decorated everything, but I couldn't shake the idea that she was somehow trapping me in this world that was all about her and Gully. The moment that really threw me off was when I brought it up. I had to, right? There were so many photos of him, and they looked too much like the ones of me, too close to our conversations. I asked her what happened with Gully. I just wanted to understand, to get her to talk about it more. But the second I said his name, she snapped. I could see the change in her. Her expression went from calm to almost violent, and her eyes, which had been warm and inviting, suddenly became cold and intense. She told me to leave. Her voice was flat, as if something inside her had clicked off. I didn't know what had happened, but I suddenly felt like I had crossed a line I shouldn't have. She was no longer the sweet, quirky girl I had been talking to for weeks. She was angry, maybe even terrified of something I had just touched on. It was like she'd been holding everything inside for so long, and me asking about Gully was the trigger. I got the hell out of there. It was like a cold wave hit me as soon as I stepped out of her house. I didn't know what the hell was going on, but something about the whole situation felt wrong. I started walking quickly, not caring about the dark street or the shadows creeping up around me. My mind was spinning. I had to tell myself I was just overreacting, that maybe I'd misunderstood, that maybe I should just let it go. But something about that house, something about the way Ella had reacted, stayed with me. I couldn't stop thinking about the photos. Was she really mourning someone who had died, or was she stuck in some kind of twisted relationship with a ghost, both literally and figuratively? Was Gully still controlling her somehow, even from the grave? I don't know if Ella's grief turned into something darker, or if she was just a person who couldn't let go of her past. All I know is that when I left her place, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly escaped something truly messed up. That night, I deleted her number, blocked her on everything, and never looked back. But I'll never forget those photos. The way they stared back at me, haunting and beautiful at the same time, like something out of a nightmare. And the more I thought about it, the more I wondered if Ella was the one trapped in the past, or if maybe it was me who had stepped into her twisted world, and I was lucky to get out before it was too late. So, here's the thing, dating apps are pretty hit or miss. One day, you're chatting with someone new, and it's great. The next, you're swiping through endless profiles, wondering why you're bothering. But then there's Lauren. When I first matched with her, I thought, okay, she's different. She was charming, super easy to talk to, and she had that vibe where you could just tell she wasn't the type to waste time. She was recently out of a serious relationship, though, which she told me right off the bat. I remember thinking, okay, maybe I'm not her first choice, but that's fine. She's just looking for something casual to take her mind off the breakup. No big deal, right? We started off pretty slow. Just some text back and forth, a couple of phone calls, and then eventually a few dates. At first, everything seemed perfect. We clicked right away, and there was something comforting about being with someone who was as open and easygoing as she was. But over time, things started getting a little weird. After about 2 weeks, Lauren started texting me more. A lot more. At first, I thought it was just her being a little clingy because of the breakup. I get it, right? Breakups suck. And sometimes you just need to talk to someone, maybe distract yourself a little. But the texts started getting more frequent. She'd ask where I was, who I was with, what I was doing. And when I wouldn't respond right away, she'd text again. and again. It wasn't long before I started feeling like I was in a constant state of answering messages, like I had to be on all the time. I tried brushing it off at first, like maybe I was just overthinking it. After all, it wasn't like she was doing anything too crazy. But the more it happened, the more it got under my skin. And that's when I started realizing what was going on. It wasn't just that she was looking for a distraction. She was using me. Not in a malicious way at first, but I could tell she was leaning on me to fill this emotional void left by her ex. I wasn't some fun fling. I was just the next person in line to give her the attention she craved. One night we were hanging out and I tried to bring it up. I told her I wanted to take things slow. I didn't want to jump into anything too serious, especially as she was still trying to get over her ex. I figured it was the best way to go about it. Be honest, let her know I wasn't in a rush. I didn't want to hurt her feelings, but I needed some space too. She didn't take it well. The second I said that, she got upset. She didn't yell or anything, but there was this tension in her voice, like I'd just done something unforgivable. She started accusing me of abandoning her and not understanding what she was going through. I tried to stay calm, but every time I tried to explain, it felt like she was hearing something completely different. It was like I wasn't talking to the same person anymore. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about healing. She was becoming obsessed. A few days after that, things got worse. She started showing up places I frequent. First, it was at my gym. I wasn't sure if it was just a coincidence, but when I saw her walking toward me, I knew it wasn't. Then it happened again. She showed up at my coffee shop, the one I always went to on Saturday mornings. Same thing, not just a coincidence. I started getting texts like, "Hey, I saw you at the gym today. You looked good." And that's when it clicked. She was stalking me. At first, I wasn't sure how to handle it. I kept thinking that maybe I was just paranoid. Maybe it wasn't that bad. But then the next week, she showed up outside my apartment building. I didn't even know how she knew where I lived. But there she was, standing in the parking lot waiting. And at that point, I knew this was no longer just someone trying to heal after a breakup. This was I remember one day I had to go to the grocery store and I was already looking over my shoulder, hoping she wouldn't show up. I was trying to be normal, just buying some food like any other person, but there she was standing in the aisle just staring at me. It was like she had appeared out of nowhere. I knew at that moment that if I didn't do something drastic, this was never going to end. I wasn't even sure what was happening anymore. I had tried everything to break things off, but nothing was working. I eventually went to the authorities. I told them what was going on, and they told me they could put a stop to it, but it would take time. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was finally doing something to get out of this nightmare. But even after that, she still managed to find ways to reach out, whether it was through friends or random people we both knew. It was like she was everywhere, and no matter what, she wasn't letting go. I don't know what happened to Lauren after that. I don't know if she moved on or if she found someone else to latch onto. But I do know that I'll never forget how it felt to be trapped in that toxic cycle, constantly being hunted by someone who couldn't handle their emotions. I never should have ignored the red flags, but at least I got out, at least for now. I matched with Sam one evening after swiping through a few profiles that didn't really stand out. I remember thinking he seemed like a cool guy. His profile was simple, some pictures of him hiking, a few selfies that weren't too staged, and a bio about loving the outdoors, good food, and a casual approach to life. No red flags. It was one of those let's see where this goes situations. We talked for a week or so before finally deciding to meet up. The plan was to grab drinks at this cozy bar downtown, nothing fancy. Just an easy first date to see if we had any real connection. I wasn't expecting fireworks, but I figured it would be nice to meet someone new and hang out. When I showed up, Sam was already there. He looked like his pictures, which is always a plus. We shook hands, sat down, and started chatting. The conversation was smooth, totally normal. He had that easygoing vibe, and I felt pretty comfortable almost immediately. I remember laughing at his jokes, exchanging stories, and just enjoying the moment. I was thinking this could actually turn into something fun. But then, halfway through the night, things started to get weird. Sam suddenly stopped talking mid-sentence and looked at me like he was confused. "Have we met before?" he asked, staring at me. I laughed it off, assuming it was some awkward joke. "No, I'm pretty sure this is our first date." He didn't laugh, though. He just kept staring at me like he was trying to figure something out. I figured maybe he was just nervous. I mean, we were still getting to know each other, right? People ask weird questions sometimes. But then it got worse. A few minutes later, Sam asked again, seriously though, have we met before? You look so familiar. By now, it was starting to feel uncomfortable. No, I don't think so. We haven't met before. I tried to play it cool, but something was off. He seemed to drop the topic for a while, and I was relieved. We went back to talking about music, his latest trip to the mountains, the usual date stuff. But then, out of nowhere, he started asking more questions. Questions that felt a little too personal. Things like, what do you do for work? And what made you get into that field? Stuff that you should have known from our earlier chats. It felt strange. I started getting more confused than anything, like maybe I had forgotten telling him these things. But no, he was just repeating the same questions, word for word, like he had no idea who I was. I gave him a look like, okay, what's going on? And that's when he dropped the bomb. He looked at me seriously and said, I should probably tell you, I have short-term memory problems. It's for a head injury I had a few years ago. Every time I meet someone new, I forget everything about them, everything we talked about. So when I meet up with you again, it's like we're meeting for the first time. At first, I thought he was messing with me. It didn't make any sense. How could someone forget everything about a person after meeting them? And then it hit me he wasn't joking. He actually believed what he was saying. The rest of the day felt off. I kept trying to push past the weirdness, but every time Sam asked me the same questions, I could see how genuine his confusion was. It was like he didn't remember a single thing about me, and honestly, it was creeping me out. After the date ended, Sam thanked me and said he had a great time, like we hadn't just spent the last few hours getting to know each other all over again. I figured maybe I had imagined the whole thing, or maybe he was just nervous and said some strange stuff. So I didn't think much of it. But then the next time we met up, it was like it was all starting from scratch. We went to the same bar, had the same drinks, and as soon as we sat down, Sam started asking me the exact same questions as before. Where did I grow up? What did I do for work? What were my hobbies? It felt like I was stuck in a time loop. I tried bringing it up. I said, hey, we had this conversation already. But Sam looked genuinely confused, like he had no memory of any of it. It was so bizarre. His face, his voice. It all felt like I was meeting him for the first time again. And I wasn't sure if I should be concerned or if I was just overthinking it. I didn't know what to do. Part of me felt bad for him. He had this strange condition that kept him stuck in a loop of forgetfulness, unable to remember anything from one date to the next. But the other part of me was uncomfortable with how it made me feel. Was I just some face he could replace? Was I ever going to matter to him, or was I just part of this weird cycle he couldn't escape? As the weeks went on, things didn't get better. Every time we met, it was the same routine. Sam would ask the same questions, forget everything I told him, and then act like we were meeting for the first time again. He seemed genuinely frustrated with himself, but that didn't make it any easier to deal with. After a few dates, I started feeling like I was just stuck in an endless loop of frustration. I never knew whether he was trying to get to know me or if he was just going through the motions. I started avoiding his texts. I told myself I would give him some space, but then I'd feel guilty. What was I supposed to do? Was I being heartless, or was I just over it? But eventually, I had to face the facts. I was exhausted. I couldn't handle the constant starting over. Each time we met, it felt like I was meeting a stranger again, and that wasn't what I was looking for in a relationship. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it felt like I was in a relationship with someone who had no memory of me, even though I had spent so much time trying to build something real. I ended things with Sam. He didn't really remember why, of course. He seemed a little sad, but to be honest, I don't think he really understood what was happening. And maybe that's the worst part. He couldn't even remember why I was leaving, and I was the one who had to carry the weight of that. I still think about it sometimes, the whole thing. How crazy it felt to be with someone who didn't remember me, no matter how many times we met. It was like we were stuck in an endless loop, and I was never going to get out of it. I met Grace on a dating app. Nothing too out of the ordinary, just two people looking to see where things could go. Her profile was really sweet and down to earth, nothing too over the top. Her pictures were cute, some of her smiling with friends, some with her dog, just your average profile. The whole vibe was calm and friendly. We messaged for a few days, chatting about books, our favorite places to eat, that sort of thing. She seemed nice, a little reserved but still really polite. After a week or so, we decided to meet up for dinner. I picked a spot I knew would be comfortable and not too fancy, but a place with good food and a chill atmosphere. I showed up early, a little nervous but excited. When she walked in, I recognized her immediately. She was even cuter in person, and I thought we were off to a good start. She was polite, and we made small talk while we waited for our food. Nothing felt weird at first. In fact, it was probably one of the most normal dates I've been on in a while. Then things started to shift. As the night went on, I noticed she was paying for everything. I'm not talking just the food, I mean the drinks, the appetizers, even the tip. Every time I offered to split the bill, she waved me off with a smile, saying it was no big deal. I wasn't going to push it too much because, it wasn't like she was forcing me to take her money or anything, but it felt weird. You know when someone insists a little too much on doing something nice for you, and it starts to feel like maybe they're doing it because they expect something in return. That was the vibe I started getting, but I ignored it, thinking I was probably overthinking. We finished eating, and I decided it was time to head out. I grabbed my coat and stood up, ready to leave, but then Grace just stood there, like waiting for something. It wasn't obvious at first, but then she started walking behind me as I made my way to the door. It was like she wasn't even thinking about it, just casually walking a few steps behind me, silent. When I reached the door, I turned around, and she was still standing there, just watching me. At this point, I felt kind of weirded out. I opened the door, and she followed me outside. She didn't say a word, just kept walking behind me all the way to my car. It wasn't like I was looking for her to say something, but the whole situation felt off. I stopped by my car, turned to her, and asked if everything was okay, like, "Is there something you need?" She smiled and shrugged, as if nothing was wrong. She said, "I just wanted to make sure you got home safely." At the time, I thought maybe it was just her being considerate, maybe even a little sweet, but the whole walk to the car, the silence, it left a weird taste in my mouth. I brushed it off, thinking I was being dramatic. But then it started happening more. At first, I didn't notice much. A few days after our date, I went to the gym, and when I walked in, I spotted Grace. She was on a treadmill, doing her thing like it was completely normal. She waved at me, and I waved back, trying to act casual, but I was thrown off. I hadn't mentioned where I worked out or even that I went to the gym. I didn't think much of it, though. Maybe it was a coincidence, right? But then the next week, I went to my favorite bookstore. I love reading, and it's my go-to spot whenever I have some free time. And of course, who do I see there? Grace, standing by the fiction section, flipping through books like it was the most natural thing in the world. This time, I couldn't brush it off as a coincidence. I didn't mention this bookstore to her. I hadn't even told her I liked reading. Still, I tried to convince myself it wasn't that strange. Maybe she liked the same bookstore. But then things got real weird. The next day, I was at work just finishing up a meeting when I looked out the window, and there she was, Grace, walking across the parking lot. It was the middle of the afternoon, so there was no way she was just randomly in the area. I didn't know what to do. I froze for a second, watching her walk away, trying to figure out how she knew where I worked. At that point, I knew something wasn't right. I didn't know how to explain it, but I felt I was being watched. She wasn't just running into me by chance anymore. It was starting to feel like she was actively tracking me. I tried to brush it off, but the next time I saw her, I couldn't hold it in. I confronted her, asked her how she kept showing up at these places I never told her about. She just smiled and said, "I don't know. I guess I just like seeing you." That's when I realized how messed up it was. She wasn't just being sweet. She was stalking me, following me around like she couldn't live without being near me. I felt suffocated, and I didn't know how to stop it. I tried pulling away. I stopped replying to her messages, ignored her calls, and told myself I just needed space. But the more I pulled away, the more she accidentally showed up in my life. I stopped going to places that I loved because I knew she'd be there lurking. It was like a game to her. The more I tried to avoid her, the more she made sure she was in my path. I started to panic. I didn't know what to do. She started texting me, accusing me of playing games with her, saying I didn't really care about her. It was like she couldn't take no for an answer. Every time I tried to break things off, she would twist my words around, guilt-trip me into feeling like I was the bad guy for wanting space. The thing is, I couldn't escape. The more I tried to distance myself, the more she accidentally inserted herself into my life. It was like I was trapped in this never-ending cycle of her showing up, me trying to get away, and her pulling me back in. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I couldn't go anywhere without seeing her. Every time I thought I'd finally gotten away, she'd pop up again, reminding me she was still there. I still don't know how to get out of it. I still don't know if she's going to keep showing up wherever I go. All I know is that I can't live like this anymore. She's made it clear that she won't let me go, and I'm stuck in this weird, twisted situation where it's impossible to escape her grip. Don't judge me. Please hear me out on this one. I met this guy named Habib on Craigslist. Yeah, I know, red flag already, right? But hear me out. He seemed cool. We had been chatting for a couple of days, and he was really nice, funny even. He suggested we go see a movie, and like, sure, why not? I wasn't really in the mood for a movie night, but he sounded like a decent enough guy, and it was a weekend, so I figured I'd give it a shot. Now, I'm not a huge fan of horror films, like, at all, but Habib was super excited about this new one, Smile 2. He was all hecked up and telling me how scary it was supposed to be. I mean, I told him up front that I wasn't into horror, but he kind of brushed it off, saying it would be fun to watch it together. It's all about the experience, he said. I guess I just wanted to go along with it, I liked him. He was cool that I didn't want to be a buzzkill. Plus, I could always cover my eyes if it got too bad, right? So we get to the theater, and things start off okay. The place is crowded, and the movie was about to start. Habib got our tickets, and we grabbed some snacks before heading to our seats. The theater wasn't full, but it wasn't empty either. We found our spots in the middle, and I was trying to settle in. But then things started getting weird. The movie started, and of course, it's a jump scare fest. I'm not having it. The first couple of scares were enough to get my heart racing, and I could tell I wasn't enjoying it as much as he was. But that's when Habib started getting handsy. At first, it was subtle. His hand brushed against my leg, and I thought it was an accident. But then it happened again, a little more deliberately. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe I was overreacting. I shifted in my seat, hoping he'd get the hint. But no, it didn't stop. Before I knew it, his hand was resting on my leg like we were a couple or something. I froze, not knowing what to do. I'm not the type to make a scene, but this was seriously making me uncomfortable. I pushed his hand off quietly, saying, "Hey, stop." I didn't want to make a huge deal out of it, but it was obvious he wasn't getting the message. But Habib didn't stop. He gave me this smile, like I was being dramatic or something, and before I could even process what was happening, his hand was back on my leg. This time, it felt way too intentional. I felt grossed out, and honestly, I was starting to panic. I tried to shift further into my seat, hoping he'd back off, but instead, he started rubbing my leg. I could feel my face burning up with embarrassment. This was not okay. I said, "No, seriously, stop," trying to keep my voice steady, but inside, I was freaking out. He just shrugged it off. "You're being a baby," he said, like it was no big deal. I couldn't believe it. I'd only known this guy for a couple of days, and here he was making me feel trapped in my seat. It was like the movie was the least scary part of the whole evening. I started to feel like I had no choice but to get up. I didn't want to make a scene, but I also didn't want to sit there and let him keep doing this. So I stood up suddenly, trying to keep my cool, but my heart was pounding. I grabbed my bag and, in one swift motion, swung it across his face. Not hard enough to seriously hurt him, but enough to make him snap out of it. He stumbled back a bit, looking completely stunned, and that was when I didn't waste another second. I bolted out of my seat and started walking toward the exit. I was so freaked out that I didn't even care about the movie anymore. I could hear Habib shouting something behind me, but I didn't look back. I just kept walking as fast as I could. I felt so embarrassed, so pissed off, and honestly, terrified. I wasn't going to let him follow me. As soon as I got out of the theater, I spotted the security guard at the front entrance. I rushed over to him, telling him everything: how Habib wouldn't stop touching me, how I felt uncomfortable and trapped, and how I had to leave the theater because of it. The guard was really chill about it. He asked me to wait for a second while he checked the cameras. I was shaking, not sure what was going to happen, but I knew I wasn't just going to let this slide. I ended up waiting in the lobby, my mind racing. It felt like an eternity before the security guard came back with some bad news. Apparently, the cameras had caught everything, the whole thing. Habib had been acting sketchy before, and they had footage of him not just touching me, but literally following me around the theater, like he was waiting for me to do something. I felt sick. He told me they'd contacted the police and they were on their way. I didn't know what to feel anymore. I was relieved that I wasn't imagining things, but at the same time, I felt violated. I'd never thought something like this could happen in a public place, especially with someone I met online. When the police showed up, I told them everything again, and they took my statement. They said they'd look into it, but honestly, I was just glad someone was finally taking it seriously. Habib was arrested right there in the lobby, which honestly was a bit satisfying to watch. I wasn't sure what would happen next, but I knew I had done the right thing by walking out of there when I did. I never heard from him again after that night. No apologies, no nothing. But honestly, I wasn't looking for any. That experience left me feeling completely shaken, and I couldn't stop thinking about how one bad date could turn into something that messed with me for weeks. It's been a few months now, but I still think about it from time to time. I never thought I'd have a horror story like this to tell, one where the scariest part wasn't a fill on the screen, but the person sitting next to me. I've learned to trust my instincts more now. I wish I had done something sooner, but at least I did something. I'm just glad I got out of there before things could have gotten worse.
Thanks for making it to the end. Subscribe to Wide Awake Horror. Please like and share.